This is our 27th president, William Howard Taft. Taft was born on September 15th, 1857 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father, Alonzo Taft, was a prominent Republican attorney that served as Secretary of War. His mother was Louisa Maria Taft. He also had four other siblings. His spouse was Helen Horan, and they had three kids together. Ever since he was younger, William Howard Taft wanted to become a Chief Justice in the U.S. Supreme Court. So he got his bachelor's from Yale University. He studied law at the University of Cincinnati, and once he graduated, he was admitted into the Ohio bar and started doing his own private practice. Ever since Taft was younger, he aspired to be in the Supreme Court. In 1887, Taft was named the judge of the Ohio Supreme Court. In 1890, Taft was named the U.S. Solicitor General, and 2 years later, he started to serve as a judge of the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 1912, he started to teach constitutional law at Yale University, and in 1921, he was named the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. In the early 1900s, President McKinley called Taft and told him to set up a civilian government in the Philippines. After this, President Roosevelt had Taft become the Secretary of War for the United States. During this, he also became the provisional governor of Cuba. Lastly, he became the 27th president from 1909 to 1913. The most prominent case that William Howard Taft served was Myers v. United States, when a postmaster was forced to resign by Woodrow Wilson. Myers said that Woodrow never got Senate approval and that he was wrongfully forced to resign and it was unconstitutional. Taft's rules on this supported President Wilson and said he should have the power to take certain people out of positions on his own. Taft said to deny the president the power would not allow him to leave his constitutional duty of seeing that laws be faithfully executed. William Howard Taft is the only person to be a president and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's also the first president to throw a first pitch at a baseball game, and he also tended to fall asleep at public functions, and he weighed 340 pounds, which made him the heaviest person that's ever been in office. William Howard Taft died on March 8, 1930. He died from a cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and inflammation of the bladder.
Landmark case Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford. Who was involved in this case? Dred Scott sued Miss Emerson, but then Chief Justice Roger B. Taney dismissed the case due to the lack of jurisdiction. The case was then passed on to John Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford. When did this case happen? It wasn't until after Dr. John Emerson's death that Scott sought for freedom. He took Miss Emerson to court after she refused his family to be free. It was in 1846 when he tried to sue her in the St. Louis Circuit Court. He lost the trial because he couldn't prove that him and his wife were owned by Dr. John Emerson. In 1857, Scott decided to take the case to the Supreme Court. This case was a big impact on American society because of the decision created tension between the North and South and is a leading cause to the Civil War. Where did this case originate? This case originated in 1864 when Scott tried to sue Miss Emerson in St. Louis. What happened in this case? In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. The ruling had three main parts. First, it said that African Americans did not have the right in federal courts as federal citizens. Second, it said that the slave states no longer had to honor the once free, always free doctrine. And third, it said that Congress should have never prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory or anywhere in the first place. The court had found Dred Scott's family legally free, but Miss Emerson had won during that time because she had moved to Massachusetts where she transferred the case to her brother John Stanford. Stanford had moved back to New York and had left Scott and his family in Missouri, and Scott was able to sue Stanford in federal courts since they were citizens in different states. Why did your case go to the Supreme Court? The case reached the Supreme Court because the federal court directed the jury to rely on the Missouri law to decide Scott's freedom. Since the Missouri court held Scott as a slave, the jury sided with Stanford, and that's when Scott took it to the Supreme Court. What was the decision of the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court ruled that Americans of African descent, whether free or slave, were not American citizens and could not sue in federal court. The court also ruled that Congress lacked power to ban slavery in the U.S. territories. Finally, the court declared that the rights of slave owners were constitutionally protected by the Fifth Amendment because slaves were categorized as property.